Welcome back. In this chapter, we're going to be covering behaviorist and other kinds of learning explanations for personality. This is chapter 6 in our Friedman and Shustak textbook. So let's get started. All right. We're going to start. First, I'm going to explain a really, old, original learning theory, and then I will explain how this might explain personality. So let's start off with theory first, and then why this relates to personality. All right, so classical conditioning. If you've had introductory psychology, you have been at least introduced to classical conditioning, I'm going to trust. If you live in the United States, you've probably heard references to classical conditioning because it's something that people oftentimes talk about. Here's a cartoon I found, in fact, that says, when Pavlov's dog begs, and his sign says, we'll drool for bells. It's a little takeoff on what Ivan Pavlov actually discovered back in 1906. He was a Russian physiologist who was interested in the role of saliva in digestion. So he was collecting saliva from dogs and then putting it on food to see if it starts the digestion process, or he was trying to figure out if you're deprived of saliva, will it make it harder to swallow your food? I mean, he was trying to figure out what saliva did for digestion, basically. So he had these dogs who he kept in kennels, and all of them had little slits in their jowl, that little, how they don't really have cheeks, right? It's that skin that hangs over their teeth. So he had a little slit in that part, and then the salivary gland was pulled out through the slit, and then a little glass pipette was attached to it that could collect the saliva as the dog drooled. Because he didn't want the dogs to get infected or hurt themselves, he had them on very short leashes attached to the side of their kennels. So you can imagine that these dogs did not have very much excitement going on in their lives, and were looking for any kind of exciting thing that happened on any during the day with any kind of predictability. So he initially found that the dogs were drooling whenever they had food in their mouths. Like, that's the normal thing. While you're eating, you drool. So as his assistants would go in to feed the dogs in the kennel, an orderly person had to push a button that made a buzzing sound, and that let the feeder know that the door was unlocked and they could get into the kennels. From the dog's perspective, they heard the buzzer, and then shortly after that, their dog food would arrive. So after just a couple of days in their kennels, the dogs would learn that the buzzer was predicting food, and they started drooling when they heard the buzzer. That was how Pavlov accidentally discovered classical conditioning. These dogs, who were only, he thought, supposed to drool when their food arrived, were actually drooling when they heard the buzzer that announced that their food was about to arrive. And that became his new, obsession in life, was to figure out why these dogs were drooling to the buzzer and not just waiting for the food. Pavlov actually won a Nobel Prize for his work on classical conditioning, which is really funny because he did not like psychology. Back in 1906, psychology was just a baby little science. It had only been, officially founded like 20 years earlier. And not even that, 25. Sorry, I meant to say 15. Psychology math, where I try to subtract 5 and I accidentally add 5. So yeah, about 15 years before this is when psychology had really been discovered. And so he was not a huge fan of it just because it was new. He wasn't sure. And also he thought it was a soft science, not like physiology where, things are so clear cut and stuff. And so he oftentimes said kind of pejorative things about psychology, sort of putting the field down. So it's kind of ironic that his biggest impact in the world of science was through research that became part of the fundamental perspectives in psychology. It's one of the 3 main schools of thought in psychology. So I guess that should be an object lesson about be careful about criticizing something too much, because next thing you know, you might be devoting your career to it. Anyhow, so he accidentally discovered classical conditioning. Let's explore what he discovered. So I'm using my dog Copper as an example, and he's not the one that you hear barking in the background, by the way. He hardly ever barks. This is a German Shorthair Pointer, and he will sometimes yell woo, woo, woo when he thinks there's like a coyote in the yard or something. But other than that, he's pretty quiet little dog. So, but he drools a lot. See those big hangy jowls that he's got? He drools a lot. So here we have Copper being our model. All right, and so before conditioning, okay, it's important to define that the word conditioning means training or any kind of learning has occurred. So when we talk about before conditioning, this would be just sort of the dog in its natural state. So I should probably let you hear the bell when I ring it. So I don't know if this is going to work very well for you guys, but hopefully it will be okay. All right, so I should record my desktop and my voice now. All right, so before any kind of training has occurred, the bell is called a neutral stimulus. It's meaningless to the dog. It's just a sound. The dog doesn't care about it. So when the bell rings, Copper has no reaction. He doesn't care about a bell. Bells are meaningless to dogs. All right, so that means that there's not going to be any response for the dog after hearing the bell. Okay. Before conditioning happens, when the dog is presented with his food, he will naturally drool, right? It's called an unconditioned stimulus because that stimulus, the food, doesn't have to be taught to be meaningful. It is inherently meaningful to a dog. It smells like food to them. It tastes like food to them. And the unconditioned response is an unlearned response, the natural response to an unconditioned stimulus. So there was no learning required for the dog to drool to food. All right. Now we're going to try and condition the dog so that it can learn that the bell is now meaningful. So what we're going to do is basically replicate what accidentally happened with those feeders who were coming to present the food to the dogs, right? The person out in the hallway would have to push the button, the door would buzz, and then the food would be presented to the dogs. Well, we're going to use a bell here. So we ring the bell, then we present the food. The dog drools as usual to the food, right? So we're going to repeat this process several times. In the case of the accidental discovery, it was, several days of buzz and then food arriving before the dogs ultimately started drooling to that. So we're going to have to do several pairings of ring the bell, then present the food, and the dog will again present its naturally, right? We got our conditions, our neutral stimulus, followed by the unconditioned stimulus. The dog produces the unconditioned response. So we would keep pairing it like that. Ring the bell, present the food. Ring the bell, present the food, right? So that the dog can, and not, repetitively so that the dog's not hungry anymore, but you're still trying to get him to drool. But I mean, like, we're going to always precede that unconditioned stimulus with the neutral stimulus during the training period. Oh, apparently I have one more attempt that I was planning to show you. So we ring the bell, present the food. The dog will respond to the food like the dog normally does. I really wanted to drive the repetitive nature down because it's not something that you would expect to happen in what we call one trial learning. You would expect to have the dog have to experience this multiple times before they start to have sort of a different reaction. So now we're going to test whether the dog learned anything from the previous, the conditioning. So now we're going to call the bell the conditioned stimulus, and we want to find out whether the dog responds to the bell the same way the dog responded to the food. Oh, he did. Oh, yay, he got trained. Oh, that was surprising. Not like I didn't make it myself. So the premise here is that after conditioning, if the dog has come to recognize that the bell predicts the food, the dog will start to drool to the bell, not just because of the food, but now they can start to say, oh, that bell, I know what that means. My food's coming. And they drool in response to the bell. So now you'll notice I used the exact same animation and everything to make his drooling picture, but now I'm calling that a conditioned response. If now the dog is responding like that because he has learned that the bell is meaningful, we call his response to the bell a conditioned response. So if the drooling is happening to something natural like food, it's called an unconditioned response. If it's happening to something that they had to learn about, now it's called a conditioned response. All right. So now it's kind of fun if you want to play along to see if you can use these parts that I just described to you to actually apply in real world situations. So here we have your romantic partner always uses the same shampoo. Soon, the smell of that shampoo makes you feel happy. So you're at the grocery store, you're looking at what kinds of shampoo you want to buy, and you're like sniffing them all. And you go, this one smells like my romantic partner. And you have happy thoughts just smelling the shampoo independent of your romantic partner. So normally in class, I try and get people to shout out what the correct answer is and stuff like that. But basically what we could argue is that your romantic partner, hopefully, is the unconditioned stimulus, and you feeling happy is the unconditioned response, right? The shampoo is the neutral stimulus to start with. Doesn't mean anything to you. It's just shampoo smell. But because that shampoo keeps preceding or keeps being accompanying or, coinciding with your romantic partner, you start to pair that in your mind. And so that the shampoo starts off as a neutral stimulus, but soon becomes a conditioned stimulus, something that through learning you have concluded is meaningful. And you start to produce the conditioned response of feeling happy in response to just the smell of the shampoo. How about the door to your house squeaks loudly when you open it? Soon your dog begins wagging its tail when the door squeaks. Okay, so I kind of masked it in this little hint, so that you really have to show your understanding. But presumably the door squeaking when you open it oftentimes is accompanying you returning home, right? And what's more exciting to a dog than their owner or parent or however you refer to yourself coming home, right? So initially the squeak meant nothing to the dog, but because it got paired with your arrival, now it's meaningful. So when you come home, the dog wags its tail. That's the unconditioned stimulus. You coming home, the dog wagging its tail is the unconditioned response. The squeak keeps accompanying your arrival. So the squeak starts off neutral, but it becomes the conditioned stimulus. And your dog wagging its tail just because the door squeaked, even if you weren't coming home, becomes the conditioned response. I actually had that happen with my other dog that barks all the time because if one of us when my kids still lived at home, if one of us saw my husband arriving in the driveway, whoever saw it would say, "Oh, Dad's home." Well, Dad's home became the conditioned stimulus for Dad being home. And pretty soon you couldn't say Dad's home without the dogs, well, there was two of them at the time, barking like crazy people because they heard the phrase Dad's home. It's like very clearly classical conditioning because it used to take my husband actually walking through the door, but us saying Dad's home now became the cue to start barking. Dogs are fun. The nurse says, "This won't hurt a bit," and stabs you with a needle. The next time you hear "this won't hurt," you cringe in fear. So assuming stabbing you with a needle did actually hurt, the cringing in fear is associated with, is the natural, unconditioned response to pain, right? So if you've experienced pain, you will cringe in fear in the future in the face of the thing that caused you pain. So the nurse saying "this won't hurt a bit" right before causing pain goes from neutral stimulus to conditioned stimulus when it actually gets paired with pain. So that "this won't hurt a bit" now becomes meaningful, and you produce the conditioned response of cringing because you know that phrase means this is going to hurt. You have a meal at a fast food restaurant that causes food poisoning. The next time you see a sign for that restaurant, you feel nauseated. So oftentimes when picking a fast food restaurant, you see the sign and you decide to go in, right? So the sign usually precedes eating there. So if you eat food and then later get sick from that food, you're going to make an association between food and sickness, right? Well, if that sign for the restaurant preceded you consuming the food, your brain is like, okay, that sign is associated with my food poisoning, my sickness. So now that sign has become a conditioned stimulus and you have the conditioned response of feeling nauseated. All right. Let's go ahead and take a break here. We'll come back in the next segment. We'll talk about how we acquire these conditioned responses.